So let's talk about some of the units in Warhammer 40k that people most want to see get better. What are some of their biggest issues and how might they be improved? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about struggling models in Warhammer 40k, going through a top 10 of them that are seen as needing most improvement by you guys. Throughout the entirety of Warhammer 40k there's always been units that have been better or worse, and often quite obviously so without too much argument between them. I probably would argue that 10th edition I think has done a better job than the majority of editions that came before it. Perhaps Games Workshop making some sacrifices with things like itemised points costs for war gear or individual model points, both to make list building really easy and also to give them a really easy job for balancing things, as if a unit just doesn't get taken then you can move its points cost down by 5 points or 10 points or something, and then see how it performs then. After a good few balance passes within 10th, it feels like really quite a lot of factions have a lot of their army at least playable, and also have made plenty of rules changes to lots of datasheets. But even then there's plenty of units that are less than where they'd be desired, plenty of stuff either falling through the cracks, and quite a lot of things seeming to have been almost deliberately neglected by Games Workshop. Certainly some unit classes in 10th edition, like flyers and fortifications, have just seemed to have been decided to be bad and that's it. For talking through a few of the models that maybe have some of the biggest issues, for this one I thought I'd ask you which ones you think most needed a fix. Went through all the answers on a really big channel poll, and here I thought we could talk through 10 of the most mentioned, plus a few other honourable mentions as well. There's maybe different ways that you could have gathered data for this one, though I feel like just going by raw numbers of things people wanted to change still isn't the worst way really. It does mean that the choices will skew a bit more towards the more popular factions out there, but also perhaps reflect some of the changes that will please the greatest amount of people I suppose. Jumping into it, and before we get to the top 10 there's a whole bunch of honourable mentions, things that got mentioned really quite a lot but didn't quite make it up into all of the top spots, and of course there's plenty more that have issues beyond this. Running through some of those quickly though, there's the Space Marine Eliminators. They felt like they've been overcosted for a while now at 85 points, just not really bringing as much to the table as Scouts or Infiltrators for their start in the mid-board role. I still kind of feel like they're paying for weirdness that they could do with an Impulsor, using their move shoot move rule to jump in and out of it and game extra rounds of shooting, which wasn't even really all that strong in the first place, but that seemed to be the motivation for Games Workshop putting their points cost up. For the Admech, Belisarius Core was mentioned quite a bit, despite the fact that he got a recent points cut to 135. I'd argue he's really not that bad a model for that points cost, though I think people just would rather him cost more and do more, as often seems to have been the case for Admech in the past. He does seem weirdly dirt cheap for a faction commander, and you might expect him to have a bit more impact and maybe better buffing rules on the battlefield. Dark Angel's characters in general were mentioned, basically everything besides Azrael, not really being super exciting or particularly efficient versus their generic counterparts. The Orc Death Dread has been in a sort of middling underwhelming sort of spot for basically the whole edition. It feels maybe kind of telling for that one that you don't really even see people use them all that much in the Dread mob formation, and that one gives it some pretty good focal buffs to it. Titanic Chaos Knights in general are a really obvious one. They've been one that I've talked about in virtually every single balance pass, being something that you could potentially fix with points fairly easily, but still War Dog spammers always tended to be the best thing for them for so long now. And for the guard there were Death Riders and Lord Marshal Dryer, just weirdly inflated points cost. Weird that the Death Riders cost more than the Rough Riders when they're far more dangerous. And Marshal Dryer I think wouldn't have been particularly stand out at the 80 points that he was in the Codex, never mind 100. For the Blood Angels, Death Company were mentioned a lot. A jump unit with Lamatis can still be scary, but they tend to get far less play versus the Sanguinary Guard right now. The Orc Buggies and Speed Freaks are another area of the Orcs Codex that Games Workshop don't seem very inclined to fix. Underwhelming datasheets, and then a detachment that doesn't do enough to make them overall worth it. Riptides came up for the Tower fair bunch. They certainly haven't been appearing in top lists as much as they used to, and I think there's a general sense of wanting this to be a powerhouse impactful unit for the Tau, so it's a bit disappointing when it wasn't. And again, like Core, I think that Tau players would rather be paying more points for it and have it being a much more impactful unit on the game, as opposed to having its underwhelming damage output. The Hammerfall Bunker suffers from fortification issues, which Games Workshop just seem to have decided to keep weak in 10th, and I guess given it's a Primaris Space Marine one, there's a lot of players out there, so I guess got more mentions than some of the other not very good fortifications out there. Necron Warriors were also mentioned, still feeling expensive at 10 points for the 20-man blocks, occasionally see some tournament play, but even in character focused ones like Awakened Dynasty aren't always the unit of choice. And the Genes of the Cult Magus was a bit disappointing not to get some sort of buff in the Codex, a fairly low impact shooting debuff that's completely outclassed by all the many other characters out there. Lots of units have issues, but let's get into the ones that were voted in the top 10 though. First up we have the Retributors of the Sisters of Battle for 125 points. I feel like they're just one of the units that in theory should be one of the big damage dealers and certainly have been in the past. And ideally their role should be a massively scary problem solver unit, pointing some big heavy guns at the enemy's scariest stuff and making it go away with extreme prejudice. Currently their datasheet has them bringing 4 multi-melters to the table, or swapping them out for one of their other heavy weapons, re-rolling ones to wound, or all wound rolls against enemies that have slain a unit at some point, though due to being both fragile and short range they need a transport to get them where they need to go. At the moment Sisters haven't really been having the best of times of it in competitive play, though Retributors themselves are near enough on-played. Maybe not 100% unusable, but certainly seen as suboptimal for what they bring to the table at this points cost. Perhaps the biggest issue is they're just not likely to kill 125 points worth of enemy unit without significant outside investment. They're probably going to need some further investment in a transport to get them where they need to be. And then if they do have an alpha strike that comes up a bit short, they're going to get killed really quite easily. 25 points for a 1 wound toughness 3 sister just isn't that hard to kill for virtually any damage profile out there. They do have competition for mainline damage dealers, things like Violent Paragons, the Castigators and melee units, and Bringers of Flame getting nerfed probably didn't help them too much. Maybe being one of the units that could theoretically be quite good with that if they were costed effectively. I suspect that in an ideal world people would want them to be scarier and cost the same amount, as opposed to just getting cheaper, though if they did that, then there'd definitely be a point at which they did get good. 4 multi-melters is adequately scary to quite a lot of stuff out there. I think with some melter units, perhaps the problem is the profile of melter in 10th edition, in that it's not likely to be particularly great against monsters and vehicles that it's wounding on a 5+ without bonuses. I guess they could change up their reroll special rule in a way, and give them something like Eradicator rerolls or some anti-keywords or similar, and give them something to be able to really take down tanks. I guess their special rule plays into the whole idea of them bringing a bit of retribution to the table, but certainly doesn't seem to be doing enough for them at the moment. Before we move on, I'd like to go a quick shout out to today's video sponsor and Tabletop Stronghold, and their one option for purpose-built magnetic miniature storage, getting models from A to B in safety. Tabletop Stronghold are a magnetic carry case maker based in the USA, and as with magnetic cases elsewhere, the idea is that you attach magnets to the bases of your miniatures and you put them on a whole bunch of steel trays in this case, so they don't slide around in storage and you can fit lots of miniatures in a very tight space without the need for foam padding or anything. Their mag cases are made out of sturdy MDF, notably incredibly durable and hard to break after they're put together. Then they have the steel trays that you can slot in at different levels, and you can raise and lower them depending on the height of the miniatures that you want to transport. The cases also have a Perspex front on them as well, which is quite nice for being able to actually see the models that you're transporting and carrying around as you take them from place to place. Typically reviews and feedback that I've seen for them tend to be really quite positive, and have dealt well with customer service issues when I've seen them arise. As well as their cases, they also have some terrain offerings as well, an MDF terrain set that's a little bit cheaper if you buy with a mag case. And from time of video release, it's around about 24 hours until the end of their spring sale more or less, so last chance to get these at 25% off for a little while. Check them out, link down in the video description if you're interested. I'll circle back to a couple of their designs at the end of the video, but thanks to them for sponsoring this one. Moving onwards with the list of units that you guys rated as needing more love than most from Games Workshop's balance update. Next up we have the Triarch Praetorians. These guys are 100 points per 5 of them at the moment, and that gets you 5 models with Necron jump packs, hitting with a bunch of Strength 5 weapons, either mass AP2 and damage 2 with the Rods of the Covenant, or a bunch of devastating wounds with their particle casters and their hyperphase swords. They can deep strike, move fastish at 10 inches, and can fall back and charge and re-roll charges, so at least a fairly general purpose sort of anti-space marine profile damage dealer. Unfortunately, in strong lists at the moment, they just basically don't really see any play. Maybe the sole exception being the Obeisance Phalanx, which certainly isn't the most favoured Necron detachment, but they do have a few more synergies and options there compared with most. Probably their issues here are that they're just not quite cheap enough to be a sort of nuisance interference unit. They pay a premium versus a bunch of Necron units that are priced in the sort of 50 to 90 point kind of mark, and as such they can't just afford to go around scoring points. They need to deal a bit of damage as well, but the damage output that they do have just isn't particularly scary against a whole bunch of targets. Particularly the Rods of the Covenant will be particularly good at destroying Space Marine infantry, but anything that's toughness 6 or more is going to be a bad breakpoint for them, and they're going to be very weak indeed against anything that's toughness 10 or higher. With no leaders, it means they have less synergy than most and won't be as good for Awakened Dynasty. And as mentioned, Obeisance could be more interesting, but it's not considered one of the strongest Necron detachments right now. For fixing them, I do feel like they have a profile that will be decent enough if they do just literally make them cheaper. I suspect that people would take a second look at them at 90 points for a cheap interference unit that can do some secondaries and put out some decent damage threat. But if Games Workshop actually want to make them more threatening Necron elites, perhaps some boosted damage numbers could help them out more, or a slightly more interesting special rule. It certainly doesn't hurt with their mobility, but maybe doesn't really push them into any one battlefield niche particularly, as opposed to just being general purpose, somewhat fast infantry. In 8th place were voted the Space Marine Primaris Aggressors, maybe being called out as one of the Space Marine units that people just want to see kind of good, given that their ideal role with loads of damage output is going to be one of the central exciting damage dealer combos of the Space Marines, but at the moment they're just not really priced consistently enough to make that good. Having seen them drop off quite a bit since the start of 10th edition hasn't been the best feeling for them either. For what they bring to the table, they're 3 wound toughness 6 Space Marines with their Gravis armour, but at 40 points that's still not exactly a great defensive stat line, but they do have a fair amount of general purpose damage output, twin link shooting with a bunch of strength 4 either with their flame storms or bolt storms and frag storms, and they get extra AP against the closest target, and then some really quite general purpose twin linked power fists in melee, which are going to leave a mark on just about anything. They're particularly good with certain character and enhancement combos, being a unit that if you can just amp up their damage a bit more, then they can go to some fairly dangerous levels. Maybe Firestorm Assault Force being one of the more obvious things for them with those flame weapons. For a strong Space Marine army list, at the moment they're just very rarely used right now, at least at top tier competitive play. A complete turnaround from earlier in 10th edition, where you'd often see combos of them jumping out of Land Raiders or even Repulsors with characters attached, or maybe the Fire Discipline combo. Again, I would say that they see most play in Firestorm, maybe with a captain to trigger some cheap stratagems for them. Though again, like the Triarch Praetorians, while it's played a fair bit, it's not really considered to be one of the strongest Space Marine detachments out there. For the problems with them, they've just basically had some progressive nerfs throughout 10th edition. Their points cost has gone up a bit a couple of times since the index came out, and that's meant that if you're not playing them with some sort of big damage combo, you're certainly not going to be getting enough out of them. Fire Discipline no longer having the big critical hits on 5+ thing was a big blow to them, losing their biggest and most dangerous damage combo, and the Apothecary Biologist going up to 70 points, largely because he was so good with Fire Discipline, was certainly not helpful as well, as particularly the Boltstorm version got on really well with him. Overall, it basically just feels like the Aggressors need to go down in points again. I feel like the datasheet is adequately exciting and does represent them well, but it just feels like they've had their points increase due to Fire Discipline, and they haven't come back down, and nor has the Apothecary Biologist, just making them to the point where even if they're maxed out with a damage combo, they only just limp into being kind of okay, as opposed to the standout unit they probably should be in that scenario. Some Tyranids were voted into 7th place, and Tyranid players chose Tyranid Warriors as the unit that were most need of improvement in their codex. I would agree that they've definitely had an unusual feel to them in 10th edition compared with, say, 9th and before. Certainly not being a unit that you'd really use as a sort of damage and defense battle line, largely due to just not really being able to take a punch quite as well as certain other units out there. They're either 65 points with their ranged weapons, 75 points with their melee, and you can double the squad. Each batch of 3 of them getting you 3 models with 3 wounds at toughness 5 and a 4+ save. The melee version either having mass, twin link, strength 5 and damage 1 attacks, and the ranged version having a mix of shooting and melee. At least for competitive games, melee warriors can absolutely get there, given that you've got 36 twin linked attacks with good AP, and some inbuilt rerolls, all powering into an enemy unit. They can absolutely pulverise a lot of infantry, and will still sat lots of saves even onto the toughest things around, though they do drop off a fair bit against things that are toughness 12, given the strength 6 they get with Synapse, would still have them wounding on a 6. In particular, they seem to be most optimal in Vanguard Onslaught, led by Winged Primes into the fight, where they can add some of their own buffs and also give them the Vanguard Invader keyword to give the whole unit loads more threat range and a bunch of interesting support options. They'll also be the focal unit of the Warrior Bioform Onslaught, though in general that doesn't really tend to be used so much in competitive play. The ranged ones, on the other hand, just don't really tend to get used that much. Maybe in an awkward spot where they're 65 points, they're really not too bad as a placeholder unit, but they're just not really all that specialised, and it means that for more optimised lists, there's almost always a unit that will do any given role that you want them to do just that bit more efficiently, whether it's a cheap chaff unit with a lot of OC swarming a mid-board objective, or providing Synapse while also adding its own value. Even the ranged ones I wouldn't say are completely unusable though. They are cheap and do provide Synapse if needed. They certainly feel like they're a fair way from being the sort of battle line of the Tyranids, as a lot of people might hope them to be. And I think the main reason for that is their durability. Just about anything in the game is at least fairly efficient at shooting them. Even lasguns will still wound them on a 5+, and their low save will mean that some wounds get through. Special weapon fire feels like they're a fairly optimal target for, and heavy anti-tank can do alright as well, taking out 3 wounds at a time. As a result, they're just not generally fielded on the front lines, and the melee ones want to hide behind terrain and jump out, as they just can't take a punch well enough. I guess if Games Workshop did see them as a problem to be fixed and wanting them to have a more damage and defense kind of role for them as opposed to a supporting one or a hiding melee unit one, it feels like their durability might be the most obvious thing to fix about them. Maybe giving them a higher save or a better invulnerable save like they've had in the past, or some sort of debuff to wound rolls or similar. Feels like all of those could be options, though I feel like maybe for the melee warriors it might well come with a points increase tied in if they did get better that way. With their current rules, it feels like the ranged ones would have to be even cheaper to break through on the regular, which maybe doesn't really feel too appropriate for them if they didn't just go for all-round statline style buffs. Maybe they could use just being a little bit more focused, either being a bit better at range or being a bit better at melee, so you've got a more obvious way to use them. Moving onwards and voted in 6th place by you guys was the Primarch of the Dark Angels, Lionel Johnson himself. Again, another interesting one that people feel like he should be stronger, but certainly is played in competitive lists right now. For what he does in game, he has a tanky Primarch stat line with a 3+ invulnerable save from the Emperor's Shield, big hitting melee with either damage 4 or a bunch of damage 2 sweeps, a few maybe slightly situational buffing abilities, and then in particular lone operative protection when he's near infantry, and a big scary fights first, so a lot of melee units just aren't going to want to charge him or put themselves at risk of being heroic intervened into. As mentioned, he does see at least a fair amount of play on the tournament scene. It seems like he's in a fairly well balanced spot at the moment, not literally in every single Dark Angels competitive list, but he does make his way into a fair chunk of them, particularly ones from Gladius and Stormlance, which seem to be their most favoured detachments right now. And he certainly is an intimidating prospect for melee armies on the other side of the table, one big scary unit that's going to take enormous chunks out of anything that gets into close combat with it, and adequately scary enough that you're probably not going to be able to ignore his impact. From the flavours of the comments, it seems like there was just a general sense that he should be more threatening with his own damage stat line, or better at laying low the toughest things around, and might not have been quite as potent a duelist as people might like, at least on his base stats. At least in terms of game balance, as mentioned, I do feel like he's fairly well balanced at the moment, at least in the more competitive game, though perhaps things like fights first are just one of the things that has more impact at a or very high big and thinking competitive level, as opposed to more casual games with perhaps less experienced players not thinking incredibly hard about his use. I guess if people want him just to be a truly standout unit, as opposed to being a bit more of a take or leave one, they could decrease his points cost down again, though I would argue that it's probably a strength of the Dark Angels army that not every single list needs to start with their Primarch, unlike say Ultramarines or some of the Chaos armies right now for their competitive builds. I feel like maybe they could do something a bit more interesting with his special rules though. Neither his Chosen one nor his Emperor's Shield one are particularly impactful in my opinion. It feels like they could maybe give him some more interesting command abilities, or even the -1 to wound if strength is greater than toughness from the Emperor's Shield. I feel like that was fair enough to have before. It was just the part about the things that are lower strength than his toughness not getting the -1 to wound that was a bit dumb. But if he did make significant improvements to either of those, he might need to increase points. I'll be interested to hear your guys' takes down in the comments though. Do you feel like he's a Primarch that needs improvement or not? Next up, and perhaps a lot more unequivocal, is the Lord Discordant. He's often been a bit of a powerhouse melee character for the Chaos Space Marines in 8th and 9th edition. It almost seems in 10th edition that Games Workshop's decided to give them an edition off, a data sheet with some slightly niche rules paired with a very overcosted points cost for him, to the point where he's certainly not been seen in competitive lists or editions so far, and still certainly doesn't seem to be even after the points decrease he got to 160. For that cost you get a mounted Chaos Lord profile, durability that's closer to a vehicle but not a particularly tough one for 160 points in my opinion, then mainly hits in melee with a whole bunch of mid-strength damage 2 attacks and has a few debuff rules that are specifically locked to targeting enemy vehicles within 12 inches. Overall, at his 160 point price tag at the moment, he just falls down on a whole bunch of different levels. His defense isn't good for the cost, his damage isn't good for the cost, he's got the mounted keywords so he needs to go around terrain, which means he'll often be taking damage before he makes close combat. And then for his supporting special rules, they're all vehicle related, so they just won't be relevant at all in certain matchups, and even when they are, they need to be close and aren't enormously impactful debuffs, rerolling some ones to wounds, debuffing hit rolls a bit with a very tiny chance to turn off shooting, which could be impactful but it only happens 1 out of every 6 times. It's kind of strange with his anti-vehicle slants that his own melee damage profiles just aren't really all that good against vehicles either, which you'd probably think that they would be. It's also a bit disappointing that he doesn't provide any sort of leader synergy for demon engines and can't make use of most of the rules from Vashtor's Soulforged Warpack detachment. I feel like he should have had the demon engine keyword for that Hellstalker so he could make use of those big Vashtor related pacts. At least that might provide one detachment where he's got some unusual benefit compared with the rest. Feels like for ways to improve him you could do all sorts of things with him really. Maybe swapping one of his vehicle debuff rules for a buffing rule could help. Maybe giving him the synergy that he wants with the Soulforged Warpack. Getting better defense in some way would be quite nice, so he's at least a bit less at risk of being shot straight off the board as soon as he pokes his nose round a ruin. I don't know if he could have something like can't be targeted at 18 inches or something like that if near to a demon engine, or maybe even something like a -1 to wound if similar, but otherwise he just needs to cost far less points than he does at the moment. 160 points just isn't really in line with him being good, even if he's amped up by an enhancement like a big 5+ feel no pain or similar. Next up, and in 4th place, we have the Astra Militarum Valkyrie at 190 points. For flyers, aircraft and fortifications, I feel like the majority of the list could probably have been then. though I think in general a lot of people have just abandoned hope of Games Workshop making them alright in 10th edition at the moment, though I feel like the Valkyrie gets special focus for the Astra Militarum, given that it's been a model that's defined entire ways to play in Warhammer 40k in the past, going full on air cav with a bunch of Scions and Guard veterans and things jumping about and throwing demo charges around. Maybe to the point of which in the past I really wouldn't have been surprised if it got its own focal detachment in 10th, if it weren't for Games Workshop deliberately deciding to keep flyers quite so sidelined. For what it does in game, it's a toughness 10, 14 wound aircraft with a 2+ save, so unusually sturdy for an aircraft, and basically with its good move it can deliver a squad far up the field for an alpha strike with some special weapons or similar, and then provide a bit of supporting fire with a few guns. They never tend to be played in any sort of competitive list, just due to being incredibly overcosted. I'd say the points really are kind of the only issue for the Valkyrie really. I feel like the datasheet's interesting enough, and it's definitely some cool utility to be able to zoom a guard squad right up into the enemy's grill turn 1, to the point of which it would absolutely get taken versus the other transports if it was an appropriate cost. It'd certainly have to be a good chunk higher than the Taurox or Chimera, but not around about 2 or 3 times the price. Generally it means that if you want to transport some guardsmen up the board, then it's the Taurox or the Chimera that you'd usually want to do so with. They can get a pretty similar result, obviously not quite as good, but given that you're paying literally around about a third of the cost for the Taurox in particular, it's just easily the better deal by a kind of ridiculous amount. I guess maybe Guard as well are also kind of hampered by the fact that just about nothing really justifies an 190 point spend. Most of the units are quite cheap and cheerful, and the most expensive in the Scions can find their own way by Deep Strike. For me though, this one doesn't really feel too complicated. Just dropping points by a whole load would be a good start. Maybe lose a good 60 points or so down to 130 points and see where it is then. But it just seems kind of unlikely at this point that Games Workshop's going to do that for aircraft, unless they decide to radically change course late in 10th. In third place we have the Stompa, a model that's in almost kind of meme status of Games Workshop deciding it must never really be all that good. It has to rank in one of the very top models that's just been consistently bad in all of its forms for I think just about every time since it came out. 800 points is an enormous investment for a Warhammer 40k army, maybe most easily showcased by the fact that it's roughly the same cost as 2 Imperial Knights stuck together, or it's more than 3 Imperial Guard Rogol Dawn battle tanks, so it has to have an enormous impact on the board. It just feels like the Stompa has several hundred points less value than that. All of its stats are pretty impressive. 30 wounds with a 2+ save and toughness 14. Guns with very big profiles but only ballistic skill 5+. Kind of crazy melee stats with a massive strength 25 and damage 10 on the claw, awesome sweeps. It's not like it doesn't actually have some good synergy this time around as well, with some big damage buffs to its shooting in Dread Mob or Mordaka. I feel like in those detachments, if playing on at least a somewhat open board where it can manoeuvre, it actually isn't unusual in casual play if you do actually build around it and support it with a mech and things. For more competitive play though, it's just really never played in successful tournament lists. The points cost is just too high for what it does really. For the damage front, it will likely destroy something, but not really 800 points worth of shooting worth. Its melee is fairly massive, but also depends on it actually getting into combat with something interesting, rather than just being screened out by some chaff infantry, which is more likely. Against more optimised lists as well, you will meet armies that can kill it with a bit of focused fire. In particular, anything with strength 14 or better weapons is going to have a really good time shooting it. On top of that, it will struggle to move around terrain due to being a huge profile. On preset boards, you might just literally not be able to access certain sections of the map. That's only going to be made more problematic if there's some chaff enemy infantry scouts or something in the way. On top of that, it's just extra underwhelming in any detachment besides, say, Dread Mob or Mordaka, where it's always going to have the best chance of at least doing somewhat well with some big shooting buffs thrown in. I feel like it's maybe a model that perhaps exemplifies the weaknesses of Games Workshop's attachment system sometimes, in that it feels like it'd be very hard to have a points cost where it's both balanced but not broken in Mordaka or in Dread Mob, but also have a points cost that's consistent with it not being terrible in other armies. In terms of what it needs to fix though, I'd say just a very hefty points cut would be a good start, though I certainly wouldn't hold my breath for that. I feel like Games Workshop places some things in the sort of Titan level of class where they decide that it's more aimed at big fun games as opposed to being anything resembling strong. I think it would be quite nice to give it a rule maybe similar to the Imperial and Chaos Knights, where the big ones can basically smash through terrain pieces of any size, and just give it a tiny risk of taking battle shock if so. I feel like that'd be quite a nice one for anything that's knight size or bigger. Voted in second place were the Plague-encrusted Terminators of the Death Guard with the Blightlords, 155 points for 5 Terminators, and that makes them the cheapest Terminator models in 40k 10th edition at the moment. Compared with the Death Shroud with their great big Man Reaper scythes, the Blightlords are a bit more of a standard Terminator equivalent, Plague combi bolters and a bunch of other things, backed up by some bubotic weapons and a Plague Flail thrown in. Generally aimed to have a little bit of range threat, a little bit of melee, but perhaps being a bit more tanky compared with Death Shroud in the past. For more normal Plague Company Death Guard lists, they're pretty well on-played, thoroughly outcompeted by the Death Shroud for any purpose that you want them for, though I have seen a few people experimenting with them in Flyblown Host, which definitely gives them a bunch of advantages that seem pretty much tailored towards them more so than any other units. But even then they seem to be far from an auto-include, even from a detachment that almost looks like it revolves around them. The main problems are that they just aren't particularly efficient full stop, really quite low damage output, there's a lot more slanted towards lighter infantry models than being general purpose, and weirdly not really even significantly outcompeting the Death Shroud on a durability kind of basis. They do get one fewer model, but they cost far less points for that, and they also get that -1 to wound built in if they're with a character, and that just means that Death Shroud are similarly tanky against a whole bunch of the things that would want to kill them per point, and that does seem really weird given the Death Shroud hits so much harder in combat. For options to fix them, points decreases don't really seem like the way that most people would want them to go. They're already the cheapest Terminators in the game, and making Death Guard feel even less elite probably wouldn't be well looked on. Seems to me that maybe they could have something to make them a bit tankier. Basically, if Death Shroud are going to have the higher damage, then these guys need to either be notably more numerous than them, or have better durability in some way, and it feels like there's multiple ways they could do that, either with stat line or special rules or more. I guess the Death Guard Codex is coming out in the not too distant future, and it certainly could change things around for them. They just need something that's a bit more of a niche, either making their shooting a bit more genuinely scary, or getting bigger and tankier profiles. I guess we'll see what they do with them. Finally, and voted in first, apparently we're sticking with Terminators. It seems that the single unit that you guys most wanted to see improved and rising up the ranks in their codex were the standard Space Marine Terminators. Though I feel like when a few people said Terminators, they were meaning more general ones. There's certainly a bunch more specific shoutouts for things like the regular Deathwing Terminators that aren't Knights, Wolfguard ones and Scarab Occult, and certainly the Blightlords as we've just seen. In general, across a lot of armies, there's just quite a lot of Terminators that seem to be kind of underwhelming for their points cost versus the competition. They might perhaps be at the absolute forefront of people's mind as well, given they've been a pretty big and focal unit for the whole 10th edition launch, with new Terminators being the single most exciting release for a lot of people when it came out. And it might be nice to have them living up to their reputation at the forefront of Space Marine armies. Focusing on the standard Loyalist ones, you get a tanky Space Marine profile with 3 wounds at toughness 5, a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable, a greater slant towards durability versus outright damage, but on that front they get a flurry of anti-light infantry shots with the Stormbolters, then a bunch of Power Fist for sort of mid-strength melee that's going to be good against elite and heavy infantry, but maybe not particularly stand out against tanks and vehicles. They have their Fury of the First to double down extra damage against the Oath of Moment target, and a slightly situational teleport Homer style rule that maybe tends to be a little bit on the niche side. Despite a couple of points drops down to 170 points per 5 of them now, they have been kind of niche and near unplayed in competitive lists. That does seem to be kind of similar for a bunch of variants as well. I'm not seeing too many people using Wolfguard ones or Deathwing ones, the same 4000 Sun Scarab Occult, but they've got quite a different context with their army, and as mentioned certainly the Blightlord ones as well. Within Codex Space Marines itself, they certainly have no shortage of competition. Lots of more specialist squads that maybe puts pressure on them as a sort of generalist unit, where they're paying for a bunch of abilities that might not necessarily help them with their focused role, and the high durability means they're just a bit more forgiving than certain units out there, and perhaps as a result being a unit that might have a bit more impact and success in some of the more casual new player games as opposed to the height of competitive. Overall though, they're just not really quite efficient enough at the 170 point cost that they have right now. That doesn't really seem to have changed at all despite repeated points cuts. It feels like more so than the Blightlords there's still room to reduce points a little bit further without driving them to be too cheap and expendable. Otherwise though, you could certainly mess with some of their stats if you really wanted to. You could buff Stormbolters for example, giving them extra AP or the pistol keyword as they kind of wielded like them, or even say give their Power Fist more attacks or something. They do feel like one of the units that might be kind of hard to adjust in isolation though, just given there's so many units that kind of use the standard Terminator base profile, and if say you tweak the Stormbolters with some extra special rules, you might have every other Terminator variant in the game asking why they don't get the same treatment, and it means that you might have to make an errata to say like 8 different datasheets, even if only some of them necessarily needed improvement. Otherwise though, they could just go ahead and successfully chip away at their points cost with further balance updates until people actually start playing with them again. I certainly feel like it'd be cool to see them at the forefront of a bunch more lists, and a more obvious choice that doesn't feel like it's making a list a little bit softer. So anyway, that's a top 10 of the units that you guys most want to see improved in various different ways. Let me know your thoughts on them down in the comments below. Do you feel like these would be some of the best units that could use a lift, or are there others that have been passed over? That's just about it for this one, but otherwise I'll just quickly cycle back to Tabletop Stronghold in the video sponsor and talk through a couple of options for their range of magnetic carry cases. As mentioned, the boxes are made of MDF and have these steel trays lined up inside them. You can see how many miniatures that you can fit on them here, like 90 infantry, 30 Terminators or 6 Armigers. For the size and styles of them, they're basically ones of different heights. The mini one is more skirmish game focused, £72 or $75, that's why it's in the sale. Inclusive of postage, though you might have to pay VAT or import duties, there's still room for some big tanks in this one, as you can see. Here's the more standard sized regular one, £114 or $120. Room for a big Chaos Knight in the bottom of this one. They all come with magnets to attach to the bases, and I'll put the dimensions of them here on the screen. There's the extra massive one that's two of the previous attached together pretty much, with different price points for different amounts of trays included. And as mentioned, they also have their competitive terrain set too, a little bit cheaper if you buy it alongside one of the rest of the boxes. In any case, check them out, links down in the video description if you'd like to take a look. As mentioned, their sale will be ending kind of soon, within the next 24 hours or so. I'll leave that one there for now though. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. There tend to be new ones out every day. If you've been enjoying the videos on the channel and you'd like to help support, I do have a Patreon page linked down in the video description. A massive thank you to anyone supporting on there. It is the main thing that keeps the videos coming. There's a few rewards such as seeing certain videos early. In any case though, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.